Welcome to the Gifted Neurodivergent Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the exploration and cultivation of the outside genius found in neurodivergence.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gifted Neurodivergent Podcast. My name is Lillian Skinner. Today, we're going to talk about the Orchid and the Oleander. We're going to talk about that in the terms of the orchid being the echoist and the oleander being the narcissist. If you were to look at the tulips and the dandelions and the orchids, and you were just guesstimate what their IQs were, I think it's safe to say that the orchids are the 120 up. If you're an orchid in the space that I'm talking, I'm thinking more like 170 and up. The empaths, even though we can't measure their intelligence in the way that the system wants to, their intelligence is higher because of their ability to see other people, because of their 3D plus ability to not only feel themselves, but to feel those of others. That's an extraordinary gift. I want you to also understand, with that higher IQ, you're going to have context issues all the time. And I run into this myself where I'm speaking on one level and the people I'm speaking with are thinking of it in a completely different manner. And when they say no, or they start getting upset with me, I realize that, oh, they aren't seeing it the way I am. I get frustrated because I regularly am not seen or heard for what I'm saying. So then I have to give context. And I find the older I get, the more I have to almost speak in parable. I have to constantly talk in a story form because people cannot actually see the picture that I'm talking of. They are taking it at a much simpler level than I actually intended it. And I get into trouble sometimes because I will say something that means in the context of what I'm saying it, but people will take it as it meant that in every context. And it doesn't. It just means in the context I'm saying it because I speak that specifically. And I think we have a lot of issues with our communication of people just not understanding that our context is deeper. I was on a forum once and they were talking about how a 30 gap in IQ led to a difference in the way we communicated, which is one of our supposed disabilities with higher neurodivergence. We're supposedly bad communicators. I'm going to address that today in this podcast as sort of a general overall picture, because I don't believe we're bad communicators. What I believe is that we are not indoctrinated into our narcissistic society. And so we move through the world communicating as non-narcissist. But our society is so narcissistic that the rest of them don't understand what we're doing because we don't move through the world that way. The echoist and the narcissist is from Greek mythology. Most of us know the story of Narcissism, where he looks in the pool of water and he falls in love with himself. He was cursed by Echo, this nymph who couldn't speak, but she could only repeat the words of others. She fell in love with Narcissus. He didn't fall in love with her, and so she cursed him. Echoism is basically the polar opposite of narcissism. Echoism means that you don't believe that you're worthy, and so what you do is you spend your time cultivating narcissists. According to Dr. Fox on a YouTube channel, he said echoism isn't a dysfunction, but I think he's inaccurate, and I think based on other things, it's definitely recognized as a dysfunction. The idea that you're going to give up your life and cultivate others is a dysfunction. You need to cultivate both yourself to cultivate others. So you cannot spend your time elevating those around you who are narcissists without a cost to yourself that's great. And I know this deeply. I know this because I grew up in a family where I was the echoist. One sister, she and I were both echoists, and the rest of them were all narcissists. They're narcissists to a varying degree. I would say my younger siblings are not narcissists to the level that my parents are, but they're fairly typical for our society narcissists. And it took me a long time to understand that most people in our society who do well in it, who are cultivated by it, end up being narcissists, because the truth is that's the whole goal of it. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. There is a gentleman who wrote a book back in 1979 by the name of Christopher Lasch called Culture of Narcissism. In his book, he talks about how our society is completely, utterly built on narcissism, that capitalism is essentially narcissism, that the focus on growth focuses also on scarcity and making sure that we constantly maintain a state of vigilance and fear and having to get more and more. And that makes us all narcissists. And I think the ultimate example of this would be hoarding of resources. We have very, very extraordinarily wealthy people right now who who hoard money and resources for them and their needs when they don't need anymore. And there's no one calling them out on the dysfunction of that. They're literally poisoning the world for all of us so that they can benefit in the short term, and it will kill us all in the long term. And there's no one that is in power that dare call them out. I also ask that you think about hoarders who hoard things and live in poverty and realize that they are considered dysfunctional, that they are called out, that cities will come up and forcibly remove them from our house and clean it up and sometimes institutionalize them or then put them back without necessarily helping them figure out why they're that way. And yet we will allow people to accumulate great wealth, which is money and is hoarding of money, and we will never call them out. We will never call that as a dysfunction. And so we've built a society that is dysfunctional, self-poisoning, and is now about to fall apart. And the only people out there worthy of picking up the mantle have been turned into echoists so that they will always hand it back to a narcissist. And so this podcast is going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the terms that I have put on it because I'm going to create my own vocabulary around this because I think that the vocabulary out there is wrong. I think that most orchids are actually narcissists and that there's really a small group of us who end up being empathic. I think that is driven by our interoception. Our introspection is driven by our interoception awareness. If you have high introspection, you have very high interoception awareness. I am one of those people that has that very high awareness. The most interesting thing for me is because I have incredibly high interoception and introspection awareness, I can feel other people's interoception signals. And I'm going to tell you in another podcast more about that because I believe that what we view as interoception has actually a whole list of their own emotions. I think that we're absolutely wrong on how it is. I believe we have interoception skills. I believe guilt is actually an interoception signal. I'll talk about that in another one because right now I want to talk about interoception awareness and narcissism and echoism. First, I'm going to define the echoist traits are people who have difficulty expressing themselves, setting boundaries, advocating for their needs and desires. They're highly attuned to the emotional states of others. They have strong desires to please, and they do this at the expense of their own well-being. Echoism is sometimes described as the opposite of narcissism. While narcissism, on the other hand, refers to a personality style characteristic by grandiosity, entitlement, lack of empathy for others. Individuals with narcissistic traits tend to have inflated sense of self, importance, and may feel entitled to special treatment, admiration from others. They also have difficulty empathizing with the emotions and experience of others, and they may have a tendency to exploit or manipulate others for their own gain. Narcissism is often associated with a range of negative outcomes, including interpersonal conflict, impaired functioning, and difficulty maintaining relationships, which is sort of funny because we have a whole society that's set up to cultivate narcissism. And then in the end, it leaves them to very lonely, broken people who are angry and use their power and money that they have accumulated to manipulate the people around him. Unless they have power or money, they're not able to maintain those people in their lives that they have close relationships with. And I see this all over the place. I know so many families where the parents have the children locked down with their inheritance or the money that they have, and the children are echoists and they're broken and they can't go out into the world because they've just been so broken by the parents. And I was one of those kids. The thing is, my parents don't have any money, so there was nothing to hold me. It was always made known to me that I was going to have to go out and take care of myself. As soon as I graduated from high school, it was like, you're out. And the same for my sisters. We weren't going to achieve much, but they didn't want us to be a burden. The irony is that they have always been a burden for us. They have not really actually delivered on their parenting. My father would constantly say, when you're older, I'm not going to become a burden. I will not expect you to take care of me, which is ironic because my dad paid about $25 a month in child support for me. He made me work for that $25 a month so hard, and he contributed nothing to my life other than making it more miserable. We took care of him, particularly his emotions. It was always us taking care of him. When I got older, I let him go first. I had a lot of narcissists in my life, and I've had to let go of the narcissists in my life to heal and get out of my echoism to become a healthy empath. But I do find that we have missed the boat on how we teach people to heal. And so this podcast is going to be dedicated to opening your eyes to the fact that our system cultivates narcissism, that our system is actually driving us all to narcissism. If we aren't able to do it because we have such high empathy, because we are in touch with our introspection to such a degree and we're good at interpreting it, and therefore we're good at interpreting others, it works against us in the system. But in life, it works for us. We are the ones who will be able to heal the world. But first we have to heal ourselves. We have to heal each other because we have not been taught how to, and we have been manipulated. There's a mastermind attempt to try to keep us from being who we truly are and having us serve the system. And we fall into it the worst because there's so few of us to mirror us to know that we're actually the healthy. So let me first define what I believe an orchid is and what an oleander is. The orchids are 20%, 25% of the population, and I think this is inaccurate. I think only the orchids ought to be the top 5%, maybe 10%. They should only be the empaths. The empaths should not be included in with the narcissist. And there are highly sensitive narcissists I want you to be aware of, but they are not that sensitive because the most sensitive people have big picture thinking. The most sensitive people cannot do harm to the group as a whole because they realize that we're all fish in the ocean. We're all birds in the sky. If I poison the air, I poison all the birds. If I poison the water, I poison all the fish. We are aware of that in an innate way. And narcissists aren't. All they care about is their needs. And so they will poison everyone, including themselves, to get their needs met in the short term. And the reason that's driving this is their interoception is so loud and they can't control it. And so it's always about them. Now, we all have really loud interoception. When I was living with narcissists, I had very loud interoception, but I still heard their emotions more than I felt mine. I still felt theirs more than I felt mine. And I can tell you, my father's interoception emotions, my father's feelings in his body were so crippling that when I felt his, I wanted to die. And I wasn't even in his body. And the reason that was is that my body had to react that way because he was so scary. He was violent and he was scary. And I thought he was going to murder me as a child. I mean, I lived in fear of that. My body had to grow up around that. And the same with my mother. She wasn't as scary or as violent, but I had to attend to her needs. So my body reacted to her needs. I felt her feelings more than I felt my own. I felt my siblings' feelings more than I felt my own. And then when I got married, I felt my husband's feelings more than my own. Luckily, I didn't grow up with my husband. So he was the easiest one for me to let go of because I realized these people don't change. And that's one thing I want to say about narcissists. They don't heal. They don't change. There are people who have narcissistic tendencies that may be in the middle and they're not empaths and they're not narcissists. And those people in the middle, maybe they can go a little bit to one side or the other. And they do fine in this world. And I would say most of those people are probably average people because they're in the middle. They're not extremely sensitive and they're able to sort of use it. They're not trying to harm others, but they'll do what they have to do. I think of those studies when they had shocking people and they sat in the seat. If the person got a wrong answer, you're supposed to shock them. And the person on the other side was an actor. And so it seemed like you were giving them shocks that were so high that they killed them. Those people that were doing that, those were obviously not empaths because if you're an empath, you couldn't do that. You just couldn't do that. I mean, I would have a nervous breakdown with something like that. As a little girl, if my parents were raging and they needed to pick on somebody, I offered myself up because the amount of pain I felt when they were mad at one of the others was greater than when I felt it. I could disassociate from my body. My body was a machine. I had a really high connection to myself and I could easily shut it off so that I could make sure other people were safe. I am so high sensing. There's no turning off my sensing. And when people tell me to just get boundaries, you may be able to get boundaries. You might be able to turn off your emotions. I have all or nothing. Those are my two modes. When I'm in all, I am in my genius. I know everything. I see everything. It's a really beautiful state to be, and I love it. But when I'm in my nothing, I am exhausted from shutting it all down. When I talk to people who were specialists in this space and they were telling me put up boundaries, I felt very angry that they were violating my boundaries, pretending that I could do something that I couldn't, and also not recognizing how much it costs you to put up all those boundaries. There's a huge cost to us. So the better thing is to not put up all those boundaries, but rather find a place where you're in your tropics. And that's sort of my goal today is that saying, hey, when you're finding that place that's your tropics, the first thing you need to do, identify all those people who are oleanders, because they're the ones who are the covert narcissists. They're the ones who are the highly sensitive narcissists. You've been programmed to serve them and elevate them and make sure they look good. And that's what our whole hierarchy does. I mean, you work in corporate America. The narcissists are the ones that are elevated, they're promoted, and the really wonderful people that you work with that do the job the best, they're relegated to the back room, they're kept down, and the narcissists step on their heads and take their work and take credit for it, and they keep moving up. We, as a society, support that. We actively cultivate that. I was talking to one consultant, and he is telling me that he had developed this program that worked with narcissists and teaches them not to be narcissists. And I said, well, how is that possible? Narcissists don't change. Isn't that the common consensus? That's what every therapist I know says. And that's what I read. And also that's my experience in life. And he said, well, yeah, they don't change, but try to teach them to be better. And I'm like, wouldn't it be a better use of the company's resources to just change their policy so they're not hiring narcissists? That'd be the thing they wanted to do at the beginning, is have a culture that doesn't hire narcissists and promote them. And he's like, well, yeah, ideally, but that's not what they're doing. I'm like, well, then they're not really being genuine. They don't really actually want to cultivate the narcissist and change them. They just want to teach them to be more savvy so that they can fit in that moment. And he's like, well, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I won't be working that. I really don't want to cultivate more narcissists. I don't want to cultivate narcissists at all. That's all our entire society does, is cultivate narcissists. And the oleanders are the narcissists who are sensitive. They see us. They know what we have to offer. And they bring us in, and then they ruin our lives. They drain us. They pretend that everything they do, they're doing for you. And they're always holding you accountable to things you're supposed to be doing back. They're keeping score. When I found myself in a relationship with someone like me, who was another orchid, we've never kept score. There's never been a moment in life where I said, you're not doing enough for me. Well, actually, the fights we have had have been about other people taking advantage of him because he's too sweet and wonderful. He always felt like he could be a good enough boy to win this race, and he can't. Thanks to my parents, I am the detector of them, and I do not at all cater to them. My job is to help you break free from that cycle. My job is to help you find others like you so you can get the proper mirroring that you need to heal and be in a healthy life. And we're looking at a time in our society where we're going to have massive change. And if you get in the right group right now, if you get in the right culture, you can bring change that will really make the society better. If you don't, though, we have narcissists everywhere that are going to make it so horrible when the structure of a society breaks. You're going to be scared for your life. And so I am trying to rally us and get us to find each other so that we can come together when we need it most. Let me go back to the oleanders and the orchids. You, if you're listening to this, you're an orchid because you care about yourself. You care about changing. You care about being your best self. And you care about delivering for others. You only grow in 11. That's the tropics. You thrive without competing or dominating. You coexist with trees, bushes, grasses, everything else without killing, and you bloom brilliantly as an addition to not have others seen, but in addition to them. So you put yourself on a tree and you make that tree more beautiful. But you are noticed. You are not invisible. In narcissistic land, beautiful orchids are on that narcissistic tree, and they're cutting your flower blooms off so that they can put them in there as jewels. And they just keep cutting them off and making jewelry for themselves. And then they say they grew them. Now, the oleanders, the narcissists, they have more zones. They have zones 8 to 11. Oleanders are considered invasive species because they replace the native plants. They're also toxic. I believe that the reason that they're this way is because they have all those feelings, but they don't have high interoception awareness, which is an intelligence. It's a body intelligence. It's part of being a genius. If you have high interoception awareness, your potential is amazing. And yet, I hear nothing about this. I have met with specialists in interoception, and they were, this is really amazing novel thought. This research isn't out there because it hasn't been done yet. The gentleman who came up with the concept of interoception actually came up with this quite a while ago, and he also came up at the same time with proprioception. Yet our society put away interoception on the shelf. We're not going to really look into that. And they went with proprioception as understanding of your space outside that you're actually physically touching. And so they studied that, and they've only recently taken up the manual of proprioception because of autism. Because those of us with high interoception, we have signals that are really loud. And if you're in a system like the school system, they're muting those interoception signals. All that scheduling, the keeping you from eating when you're hungry, drinking when you're thirsty, going to the bathroom when you have to go to the bathroom, all of that mutes your interoception. That's part of the Prussian education model. If you have it so high, it will actually do the opposite. Opposite response then is that you hear and feel your interoception signals in your body so much louder because you've repressed them, and then they come screaming up. And if you don't learn to handle them, you don't learn to interpret them, then you become a narcissist because you have to get them back down. You have to quell it, essentially. If you have good introspection, then what you do is actually learn how to interpret them. And you get to learn and interpret others. So your empathic skills grow, whereas the narcissist skills are diminished because then they're almost slave to their internal signals. They're so loud, they're so painful, that's all they can see, do, and care about. Now you need to learn how to cultivate that. Now you need to learn what to do with that. And that's what I've been working on. Now I can't declare myself an expert because the only thing I'm an expert of is me. And I've said that before. And what I want to make you an expert of is you. I am not an expert in these fields. What I am is an expert in Lillian and her neurodivergence. And Lillian is very sensitive, and I understand how I move through the world. And I have had to push back my whole life on other people's perceptions of me because I have come to realize that I am so far outside normal that their perception is wrong. That when I go to the doctor, I can guarantee that they're probably going to tell me misinformation. And I have to educate them about me, and they still don't believe it. They still don't trust it. The more they spend time with me, the more they see. When my children were younger, my youngest one, they declared was too fat when she was 18 months old. And at 18 months old, I was still nursing her, and she didn't really eat food. She mostly just pushed it around, but she was a chubby baby. But we're really tall. This little girl will someday be 6 foot tall. And she was going to go through a big fat growth spurt. And so she got chubbier, and she was in the 80th percentile for weight, but she was in the 99th for height. So I didn't care. And the doctor kept telling me to put her on a diet. And I'm like, she doesn't eat food. She's only nursing. She doesn't really feel like eating. This is because nature intends it. I'm not going to do that. And then sure enough, 6 months later, she went through a giant growth spurt and she got down really thin. She was a skinny little, beautiful little girl at 4 and 3. But at 1.5, she was a meatball. And that doctor insisted I needed to do this and told me she couldn't be my doctor anymore if I wasn't going to listen to her. And they're so disconnected from our natural state. They're so disconnected from the outliers that they will try to force us into being average, even though their own numbers are telling them otherwise. I went through the same thing with my daughter in the math in school. We are not allowed to be who we are in our society because that would make us exceptional. And in a narcissistic society, only the ones that they deem exceptional are allowed to be it. So again, I'm not an expert. I'm not deemed as an expert by society. I'm just someone who's speaking their truth, and I would like to hear yours. When we meet with Oleanders, they reflect us. They use our emotions, though, against us. They know what we're doing, but they themselves don't have self-control. So because they don't have that introspective awareness and they can't control their feelings and emotions, they decide to control everyone else. And they are from zones 8 to 11. So they still need that warm, southern, balmy, good soil. They need to be in a space that cultivates that particular plant. They're pretty, they grow abundantly, and everybody likes oleanders, even though they're poisonous. And that's kind of how I would describe a narcissist. They're very charming. They take good care of themselves. They make sure they look attractive, but they don't actually play well with others when it comes down to mutual sharing. Unlike the orchid, who is beautiful, they're stunning. They stick out, but they play well. They don't take too much space up. They share. When that oleander is terraforming and they're changing that world by controlling everyone else around them to create what they need as their zone, they're causing an intense amount of damage. And the more they have to change it because their interoception is so loud, it's screaming with so many signals, their emotions are so high, the more they make you adjust for that. And my brain and body has adjusted for it so much because I grew up with parents who had very high screaming signals and no ability to control them. Christopher Lasch wrote this book, The Cult of Narcissism, talking about America. And he actually gave us an example where he said in his book how mothers are taught not to know their children, not to trust their own instincts on raising their children and seek the experts of others. And he spoke of mothers reading books and having despair because they didn't feel like they knew how to raise their child any more than they did before they read the book. And so then they go to the experts, their pediatrician or what, and they listen to the experts and they don't necessarily serve their child because, as in my case earlier, my child's an outlier. And I knew what she was going to do. She was my third, and she also had a similar composition of body that I did. We go through these huge growth spurts. We put on a little bit of weight before we go on them, and then we shoot up. I knew that for her, and so I ignored the doctor. But had it been my first child, it would have been different. I would have been very stressed out. And we are so cultivated in our systems to not trust our own knowledge and to read books that only give us 2D information, but not actually enough case studies and enough individual stories. Our stories of fiction are considered not real. We look at nonfiction, which is always generally 2D because it doesn't involve case studies and it doesn't have all the full story. You don't have context over how it relates to you. It's applying to average. And if you're not average, you think that you're wrong. But if you found a full story, you'd be able to say, well, that person's not like me at all. You found a full story and you read just biographies and you read just memoirs and you read the fiction where it is a complete story of someone. And when it's well written, it's a real entity almost unto itself. you find yourself in that person or you don't. And you know that, well, that person really isn't like me. I need to go others. When I was a little girl, I read all of the fiction I could get my hands on, particularly the Newbery winners, because I saw myself in those children. What I realize now is those children were actually adults writing children. So they had adult mentality. And that's why I found myself in them, because I was driven to adulthood very young by my family situation. But I needed that. I needed somebody to make me feel normal, someone that reflected the world the way I did. And it was really important, because if I didn't, I would have lost my mind. So thank God for the fact that I like to read, and I did so much of it as a child, because it gave me mirroring that I couldn't get in the real world. Now, one thing I'm not quite sure on is if our systems are able to turn this off or on. I mean, they talk about how families with dysfunction target the most sensitive child. I believe that's pretty logical, since the most sensitive child are going to have the most reaction, and people who are struggling want everyone else to serve them, terraform their world so that they can make it easier. The narcissists who are struggling are going to make everyone pay for their struggle. And the echoists who are struggling are going to keep it to themselves, and they're going to beat themselves up for it. So in our society, we go into our school system, and if we're an echoist and we're struggling, we won't let other people know, because when we let the teacher know, the teacher is in a narcissistic structure, and she's not going to help us to the level she can, because she's got 20 to 30 other students. If your struggle, like mine, was being so different that you don't even understand what they're talking about, because they're talking in a way that you've either moved through or it's missing the information, because you do need that full picture because you're just that different, you're never going to ask, or you do ask a few times and you get shot down, like stop being annoying or stop requiring so much of me. And so you learn really quick that you're not allowed to do that. So then instead what you do is you start helping the teacher. You serve the teacher. And then when you ask, the teacher gets mad at you because she's used to you serving her. So then you get stuck in this cycle of you serving the narcissistic structure, and that being the way you're validated. And so, of course, you become an echoist. If you're born an empath and you don't have great parents and you're not put in a school that's really the Montessori school or homeschooled, there's no possible way for you not to become an echoist, if you ask me. The only other choice is a narcissist. So if you're an empath, you're going to obviously become an echoist. You're not going to become a narcissist. When you get out of the school system and you go into the workforce, what happens? You follow the same exact structure as you found in the school system, except for now your livelihood is on the line if you're not serving the narcissist. Narcissists love echoists. They make little armies of them. So that's why when you go into the workforce, you find others like you and you commiserate with them about how serving the narcissist is this horrible lifestyle you're all going to live. And none of you move up the ladder. You end up staying in that department forever, and you're watching the worst people move up. And they say that's changing, but I really don't see it. I see narcissism more prevalent than other. Narcissism is what is causing the downfall of our society. And back to Christopher Lasch, that's exactly what he said. Everything we do in capitalism is about narcissism. We have retail therapy, and he wasn't talking about therapy where you go to a therapist. He's talking about how everything is made. You know, we're all miserable in this system. And so what they do is they offer you incentive. Get a new car and it'll make you feel good. Get a bigger house and it'll make you feel good. Wear these clothes and it'll make you feel good. Do this sort of style or take this finishing course and it'll make you feel good. And it was all about you terraforming yourself so that you're a better person, you become this. And so those of us who are echoists, we work so hard to be something we're not so that everybody else finds us acceptable, and we become the shell of a person. And then we align ourselves with someone who seems to have this very clear sense of who they are and are moving through the world as a narcissist. But really what they're doing is just manipulating everyone around them to agree with their perceptions, their reality, and live within their reality. And I think about how sad this is. And then I think about farming. And I know this is a weird analogy, but like every single person I know with high neurodivergence, we love our documentaries. We watch pretty much only YouTube, and it's usually about real life. And one of the things that we're really into right now is this show that has a sheep farm. She is going through lambing season, and she's having all these babies, these ewes just having 3, 4, 5, 6 babies, just constantly, hundreds of them in this 2.5 week period. And one of the shocking things to me is how much death is involved with birth. I mean, we're not used to that. How much our society, by making us specialize and by making it always the same thing, teaching 30 children or even 20 children and only seeing pregnant mothers and only seeing people who are all the same specialty or working with all the same people in a group all the time, it desensitizes us. We have lost our ability to see the variation. In a long term might be good, but in a short term way, it's horrible. And this woman is coming in and birthing these lambs with, and sometimes she says, oh, that you just stomach muscle blew out. Now I have to cull her. And it's very casual. And she's like, oh, well, that one was one of my faves. That's too bad. And these babies are born and they're dead. And one was mummified, or several were mummified. And it's a tragedy every time we watch it. I don't watch it with my youngest. It's shocking to me. And yet it's so very much a symbol of our system. We have lost our humanity. Just like these farms, we are not individuals. We are not special or requiring of different things. It's just about shoving you through. That's not the natural state for us. And we have an opportunity. We have a chance at what we're looking at in the future to maybe go back closer to that natural state. And I think we should take it. I think we should jump on it right now, try to learn ourselves the best we can, and move back to that. Because I don't want to stay where we're at. I don't want my children to be in these schools where there's like ton of kids and they don't get what they need. They can't ask the questions they need. That is what's going on now. Your children are brilliant. You are brilliant, and you have not had your needs met because you're too far away from average. This woman who cares about these lambs also doesn't. You can tell she's burnt out. You can tell she's exhausted. You can tell that if she had 1 or 2 lambs, she'd adore it. But she has 100, 200, 300 lambs, and she can't see them. She cannot see the forest for the trees. And I cannot tell you how our narcissism has gotten worse, partly because the narcissists are more stressed. The empaths are more stressed. Everybody's more stressed, but the echoists are also more stressed. And so we are not our best selves. And yet we keep putting out all these mantras and, oh, you just need to work harder or smarter or what the heck ever, sleep and this is a sleep hack. How about we just not work this hard? How about we roll back? All of the production we have done since the 70s, the ramping up of more and more American workers have become more and more efficient in production. None of us have gotten in our wages. It went straight to a tiny group of people at the top who have just gotten greedy beyond words. General Social, the one bank, was just saying, we're in greedflation right now. This is not real. This is just greed at the top. We have to change that. And the first thing we do on that process is we figure out what is right about us and we don't budge on it. I knew a long time ago I was not going to be rich on what I did because I'm an individual one-on-one person. And I also knew because I am an outlier. I am not going to produce something that the masses has interest in. In fact, what I'm doing right now may not be of any interest, like a really small group. And maybe in 100 years, if we go in a good direction, maybe the rest of the group will be interested in what I'm saying. But right now, I know that it's only a small group that's going to have any interest in what I'm offering. And I know that what I'm offering is healthy, that it's good. I know because I went through this whole journey to get here. And when I got here, I realized, oh, my natural self was always there. I just was trying too hard to be something I wasn't. And when I became myself, this is so easy. All the effort, all those, the Carl Jung's light and dark, and all the back and forth you have between your two brains, when you actually become who you're supposed to be as an empath, it's all easy. You unify your feelings and your thinking and move through the world with ease. You're aware. It's easy. And so the goal is for you to find others like you so that you can see how healthy is, because it's so rare. Healthy empaths are so rare. Even the advice we get on being a healthy empath is wrong. It's not about fitting in. It's not about serving the system. It's about you creating your own so that you're healthy and you can help others be healthy. I'm going to go back to Christopher Lasch and how he talked about narcissism affecting us as we went through our eras. He talked about how narcissists typically peak early and then in the end, they're very lonely. Whereas the echoists kind of have the opposite. And he doesn't talk about the echoists. This is just from other information. The echoists and the empaths, they actually find out later that their lives have always been good. And I found that I don't need to change myself. It took me well into my late 30s to realize I don't need to change myself. That what I was setting up was healthy and that it was innate for me to be healthy and that my high sensitivity drove me to healthy. But the narcissist, I see the opposite. I see that my family has gotten more despondent as they've gotten older. My parents, who were considered the special and the golden child and pretty and talented, went out into the world. They could manipulate people when they were younger, and then when their looks went away, it became harder and they became weirder and odder. And I think it's so interesting that my natural state of being was considered odd. And I realized that my natural state of being is not being narcissistic. It's actually egalitarian. When I write people and say, hey, I'm this or this, and I wanted to know if you wanted to talk about it because I have some theory so that I could figure this out and maybe it'd be of value as well. And sometimes people are like, yes, definitely. And they come right back to me. But a lot of times people have an assistant say, no, thanks. Or they'll come back and let me know that I'm out of line, that I didn't follow the structure or wrong. Well, why would I be wrong for saying I'm this or that? It's like, I'm different and I'm just stating that. But apparently you're not supposed to state that you have autism and that your kids are savants and that you've figured out some stuff and you wanted to talk to somebody about it that you think might help understand why and how this is working. You're not supposed to state that, apparently. Other people are allowed to state that they can run so fast and they can do this stuff and that's special, but I'm not allowed to state it. I find that to be very interesting, that I can't go to people and say, I have this condition and I am researching it. And because my condition is not supposed to be positive, maybe a good thing, a difference that might be helpful. No, I have to accept it as a burden. But I don't see my autism as a burden. I don't see my ADHD as a burden. I see it as part of my offering. I like it. I think it's great. It helps me see very clearly the world. It helps me avoid huge pitfalls. I don't understand this idea that I have to come in as less than. But that clearly keeps getting repeated to me. And when I know people say that, I know they're a narcissist. Because they have to maintain a structure of hierarchy. And I'm not coming at them with the structure of hierarchy. I'm coming at them as who I am, my authentic self. And the way they interpret that tells me who they are. And I find that the amount of information I get back from the people who are most upset is so much greater than those who actually connect with me, because I learn how they see the world, because their emails are so filled with emotion, and emotion has so much more context. Emotion tells me the 3D when they just give me back a letter saying, oh, and they give me a few things, I only get 2D. I would rather have their emotion authentic so I can see the big picture than just have them be polite. Because by being polite, I don't actually see the big picture. I am considered not polite because I move through the world in my authentic self, even though I allow people to speak, even though I see them for who they really are, because I do not follow the hierarchy, because I do not defer to them in intelligence, because they have more PhDs than I do, because I have 0, I am seen as rude. But that logically doesn't make sense to me. I'm not supposed to do those things. And that's one of the things I want to change. For our group particularly, I want you to be your authentic self. I want to know exactly how much you changed and grew, and I don't care what you got ordained from the system. I want to know about you. I want to know what books you read. I want to know how wonderful you've learned as you went through life. I really don't care what the system has deemed you as. That system's about to go away, and it's now time for us to figure out who has what to offer naturally. It's about time we cultivated that. I have friends who are consultants to the school systems and to the university systems, and they're saying everyone that is in those systems is scared out of their minds because the kids are not learning what they need to learn. But they're not teaching what those kids need to learn. The people who are running those things are more interested in teaching those children control and be forced into this level that's very low than they are educating. For my children, what I'm trying to do is create adaption. And for the people I work with, it's about self-learning, self-knowing, and then self-adapting. And that is the goal. There's just one last point that I'm going to have today, and that's about individualism. We have a culture that screams about individualism and how we're such an individualistic society. But I want you to realize that that's a lie. We have very little individualism. We're all trying to wear the same clothes. We're trying to drive the same cars. We're trying to live in the same houses. We're all trying to match up to each other. And so they oppress our individualism very, very extremely by putting us into groups and into the schools and making us stay in these groups and stay in our averages. And then when they come out, they try to sell you things to define your individualism instead of letting you do it from your own space the whole time. Lasch was talking about how we'd use our retail therapy to buy things to soothe ourselves, and how we've lost our independence. We don't learn to sew. We don't make our own fashions like we used to. We don't make our own music like we used to. We don't do all of these things that we used to do. And he obviously wasn't talking about the neurodivergence, because we are the ones who actually still do that. We've always done it and we always will. My children take sewing camps when they're quite young because they want to learn how to make their own clothes. That is very neurodivergent of them, isn't it? I know so many neurodivergents who follow their own fashion. I'm guilty of this. I love certain vintage things and I save them and I collect them because they're just beautiful. There is so much about us where we don't care what is going on in the world around us because we haven't bought into the narcissistic society. We know what we like. We want that. And that is perfectly normal and healthy. Now, I just want to leave you knowing that you're amazing, that you have figured out what you are and what you like, despite everything working against you. And now we need to spread that to your entire life. Who you are is innate, and it's so strong. And all that turmoil you're having is just you trying to be born as you really are. And that's what I want you to achieve. That's it, everyone. Thanks for listening. You take care.
The views, information, and opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent Gifted ND Incorporated, Lillian Skinner, or the Gifted Neurodivergent Podcast. This podcast, Lillian Skinner, and Gifted ND Incorporated are not responsible and do not verify the accuracy of the information contained in this podcast series. The primary purpose of this podcast is to inform and educate. The Gifted Neurodivergent Podcast is only available for private, non-commercial use. Any other use of the information contained within this podcast must be done with express written approval and knowledge of Lillian Skinner. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute any part of this podcast. The developer assumes no liability for this podcast or its use on any other podcast or other media.